Welcome everyone to a panel discussion on, I think, what is a timely topic, political representation in the digital age. We will have a discussion and afterwards about 20 minutes for questions and answers as well. So while you're listening, if you have any questions, please write them down, or remember that you wanted to ask something, and you can do so after the discussion is over. And I think we were discussing this earlier on, and I think we want to try a Chatham House rule during the Q&A. So this event will be recorded, but only up until the questions and answers round. So the panelists will feel more free to discuss things that they maybe wouldn't want the whole world to know, because we have people here who are kind of sitting on many chairs at once, both as academics or activists or even in ministries. So there might be sensitive issues as well that they want to discuss, but perhaps can't if it's being recorded. So you can ask bold questions as well in the Q&A. You don't have to worry about anything. And we will have a small reception afterwards, so you can talk amongst yourselves later on and discuss these ideas further. But first, before we begin, I would like to give the microphone to the French ambassador, Claudia Delmas-Scherer. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I won't be long. It's you're here not to listen to me, but I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that we are very proud at the French Embassy and the Institut Français, which is a part of the French Embassy, we're very pleased to welcome you tonight and to have this discussion organized around a theme that is very much on a hot topic in France. That will be something for our panelists to explain to you later. I think it's important that we at the Embassy of France bring news to Estonia about what's also taking place in other countries. Estonia is so much in the center of everything that is digital that we tend maybe to forget that things are happening everywhere, somewhere. You know, earlier this afternoon when I was preparing a little bit for this event, I arrived to a website talking about some digital e-governance things, and there were six examples, and I went through them, and none of them was Estonia, and I was shocked and outraged in a sense, because I became really like an Estonian in that sense. I mean, Estonia must be somewhere there in an illustration of what is e-governance, governments. So I wish you a very good discussion, and really looking forward to hearing what our panelists are going to discuss. Thank you very much.
Yes, and we at CitizenOS want to thank the French Institute as well for being such great partners. Unfortunately, one of the panelists, as you can see, is missing, Mr. Javari. He had a proceeding at the parliament that he couldn't postpone, so he had to be there. But there's a chance that he might still come later on, not today, but somewhere in the future. So we're already kind of preparing for the next event already. So maybe you will get a chance to meet him as well. A few words of my own. My name is Kadi. I work at CitizenOS, and I also research online democratic engagement at Tallinn Technical University. And I'm really happy that we can have this debate here in No Theatre, because as most Estonians probably know, this theatre is quite well known for being politically active in its art. And I think this is quite symbolic that we get to have this kind of provocative debate here. And hopefully we can have the next one here as well. But we can now get to know our panelists a little bit. First we have Maija. Maija is from Finland, and I know Finland is close by, but I'm sure most of you don't really know that much what's going on there in terms of open government or e-democracy. But Maija has been researching all of those things, and I think one of my favorite papers of hers deals with the open ministry, and we can get into the details of her findings later on, but maybe you can explain to the audience what the open ministry is and what it does, and what you as a citizen, not as a researcher, benefit from this endeavor.
Thank you, Kadi, and thank you for the invitation.
Is the microphone on?
Can you hear me? Great. So, Open Ministry, it's a website, first of all. It's an online platform, openministry.fi, and it allows for collecting signatures for the Finnish Citizens Initiative, which is it's a so-called agenda initiative, and 50,000 Finnish citizens can suggest or put forward a proposal for the parliament to be dealt with, and the proposal can either be a legislative proposal or then just a more less formal proposal for to take action. And we've had this institution since 2012, and Open Ministry was the first platform that allowed for collecting the online signatures, and before the government actually managed to put their own governmental platform into action. And so the Open Ministry platform was coded and organized by these grassroots activists.
Thank you. Next we have Pierre-Louis, who is from France. In addition to perhaps like baguettes and berets, France is also kind of famous or maybe even infamous for its bureaucracy. But what most people probably don't know is that France is also kind of a hotbed of e-democracy, digital innovation in democracy right now, and Pierre-Louis has been kind of in the midst of this, basically from the beginning, as I understand, kind of. Yeah, and he's done work with DemocracyOS in the city of Nanterre, and also, well, he works now at the digital agency of the French Ministry of Economy, and he's also part of the OpenDemocracyNow team working on open source tools for democracy. So you've seen your fair share of all these e-democracy tools. Maybe you can share some success stories and why they've become successful, and how does this success even look like?
Well, thank you. First, I would like to thank Madame Ambassador and the French Institute and CitizenOS for the invitation, and to apologize for my thick French accent, but I do my best. So yes, I do proudly represent the French bureaucracy, but I work as well as an activist for an open source movement for digital democracy. And what's interesting in this movement in France, that it's a very mixed movement with both civil servants, academics, and activists working together to build these tools. And we've had an ongoing discussion for the past 3 or 4 years to put into action this tool. It's been quite difficult because it's a very vivid civic tech field in France, with some conflicts between for-profit projects, between non-profit projects, between public projects, and the implementation of this tool has been sometimes problematic. So, but we've had a lot of these experiences and experimentation so far, and most of them focused on public debates. Or we can have a public debate, or we can have a consultation on the internet to influence policy. And this is the main topic discussed in France, besides open data and open tools. And the fact that France was the president of the Open Government Partnership, which is a partnership between 70 countries for open government, was very influential in the thriving of the civic tech movement in France. So to get back to the examples, one I like that was successful was when I worked with DemocracyOS with the city of Nanterre, which is a city about the size of Tartu, I think, of 100,000 inhabitants, near the suburbs of Paris. A very complicated city because a lot of different neighborhoods, a lot of transportation problems, and we had to do a citywide consultation with citizens in order to discuss the future of the policy that what was implemented at the middle of the milestone. And we use DemocracyOS, which is a very basic tool for online debate, which is an open source software developed in Argentina. And you can have topics, you can add your opinions, you can upvote the opinions, and basically that's it. But it's very intuitive, and we built a platform around that to consult the citizens. And it was successful not because of the technology, but because of what the tools that were built around them to get people to the platform. And a good civic tech, we had a lot of different other consultations with this tool. A lot of them failed, but this one worked because we had physical moments to get citizens to participate, because we had a community outreach, because we relied on NGOs or on neighborhood councils and on written contributions to the platform, with civil servants writing down on the platform, typing down on the platform what was written on paper. And it was an experience of digital democracy, but 2/3 of the contributions came from local meetings, from physical written contribution, which were written down on the platform. And sometimes from communities of immigrants who do not speak well French but had to be included. So we had some translation, we had some communities working with them. So you had these voices of citizens within the city who were put by civil servants on the platform alongside the electronic contribution of the usual suspects of politics, of activists, of tech-savvy citizens from all the executives working in the business district of the city. And you could say it's a proof that digital democracy fails, because what was working, what was the non-digital part, which was getting on the platform. But in the end, when you digitalize it, it goes on the open data files that you put in the report. It goes to the report that goes to the city council, and then you can use the voices of the citizens. You can confront the administration and the mayor's office with that. And well, by digitalizing these contributions, you can empower them thanks to all the political and administrative and data implications it has.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Marco. Marco is from Italy. And if anyone knows anything about Italian politics these days, it's probably Beppe Grillo and the 5-Star Movement. And well, what you probably don't know is that Marco actually went through with kind of a unique experiment as an academic, and he became a member of the 5-Star Movement just so he can explore and research their online e-democracy tool that they have called Rousseau. And he wrote a very, very interesting article about this. So maybe, Marco, you can tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I'm a member of the, can you hear me? Okay. I'm a member of the 5-Star Movement nominally, but probably a non-voting member, meaning I'm not gonna vote for the 5-Star Movement. I became a member so as to study the platform Rousseau, because back in 2016, you couldn't access the platform without being a member of the party. Now you can. In 2017, they actually opened it up in a guest mode, and so you can access the platform without becoming a member, but back then it wasn't possible. And besides doing that, I also attended their national meetings. I interviewed both elected representatives and party members. I distributed a survey recently. I still have to crunch the data from this survey about Rousseau. the French philosopher, which lends the name to the platform, to the decision-making platform of the 5-Star Movement. It's a party that, as you might know, is polling at around 30% right now. Italy's general election is coming up in March 2018. The 5-Star Movement is well positioned to be the first party at the next general election. However, it's unlikely that it's going to be able to form a government because their official position is that they're not going to be forming coalitions with any other party, and you cannot run with the current electoral law the country with 30% of the vote. This is just to give a little bit of context. So they launched Rousseau in 2016 as Rousseau, they called it this way, but the platform was actually launched as was called the Sistema Operativo, the operating system of the 5-Star Movement back already in 2013. And there's a number of things you can do on this platform. It currently has 140,000 registered users that can participate in a number of activities. The most frequent one is actually voting. You can vote more than once a month on a number of issues. Currently, they are mostly voting the party program that they're going to be presenting at the elections. What does it mean to vote the party program? That you're giving a question with a set of options and answers that you can select from, right? So it goes through different topics, energy, labor, foreign policy, and how do you form an opinion about this question? The Beppe Grillo blog, I assume you know who Beppe Grillo is. He runs this very popular blog, which at a certain point in history was like the 8th most popular blog in the world back in 2005, I believe. So there is an expert on the blog talking about, say, energy or labor, and the expert gives an opinion, and then on the basis of the opinion of the expert, you can, vote. The question is basically asking something that the expert went through. And I want to make you notice that it's only one expert that gives his opinion. That's not the only thing you can do, though. You can also vote for the party primaries. So you can select, they do party primaries in the 5-Star Movement, but they don't do them in a physical context. They do them online. So you can select candidates both for the national election and the local level. You can provide feedback on all the bills of law that elected representatives of the 5-Star Movement are currently elaborating at the regional level. Italy is divided in 20 regions, at the national level and at the European level, because they have MPs elected at the European Parliament, 160, now 130 MPs in the Italian Parliament, and then thousands of councillors elected in cities and regions around Italy. So the regional councillors, the national MPs and the European MPs, before they submit an official bill of law into Parliament, they actually propose it online to their members. The members can look at it, have 60 days to discuss it. They can get a feedback from the representative or not. At the end of the 60 days, the representative is supposed to write a short report and then saying, I have taken up these comments and I've amended the bill in this way, and now I'm going to be submitting this text into Parliament. And I want to make you notice that this changes pragmatically the Constitutional Convention, because the Italian law doesn't say anywhere that a bill of law has to be discussed with the citizens first, right? It is discussed with the citizens first and then with the other MPs. Then what else? Well, they have a peer-to-peer area for local councillors and regional councillors in which they basically upload all the city ordinances, local legislation proposals, and if you go there and say you Google, and you don't Google, you search for water, you will find, say, all the proposals coming from M5S, five-star movement representatives that are related to water, right? And so, for example, a local councillor in the city of Rome can look at a proposal from the city of Milan and decide to duplicate it, right? So these are official acts that are uploaded on the platform, and there's literally thousands and thousands of them, and this is something that's never been done by other representatives in Italy. So even a regular citizen now can access these acts directly online. Then there is an area called Call to Action, where you can publicize local initiatives. As a five-star movement member, we are organizing an event like this. You can publicize it on Call to Action, and everybody else who accesses the platform can see it. There is a kind of a map, similar in this case to a Google map, where people can find these events. And I think, and there's also a training, e-learning session. And why is there e-learning session and co-training? Because the five-star movement representatives, it's called the movement, are not professional politicians, right? So imagine that somebody like you or me enters city council, and you have to learn how to run, how to do your job, basically, right? So if you were part of a traditional party, maybe you could get a traditional cadre school formation. In this case, it's done online, but also through meetings. Five-star meet, for the most part, through Meetup. The Meetup platform, they use it mostly for events. And then they have Facebook groups. So I'll finish it here. The last thing I want to say is that my critique of Rousseau is that in Rousseau you can make a lot of decisions. You can provide a lot of feedback to elected representatives, but there are no tools for discussion that are really integrated within the platform. So the discussion happens elsewhere, for example, on Facebook, on a Meetup group, or in physical meetings, but there is not a clear connection between the moment of decision and the moment of deliberation. Finally, I forgot the most important area, actually, of the platform, which is called Lex Members, where you can, most important because they present it as a direct democracy platform. So on Lex Members, you can propose your idea for a bill of law. And every, say, 4 to 6 weeks or so, about 100 ideas, they're really ideas, they're not written in any juridical language, get voted. So you look at them, you have only 8 hours to vote, from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., to 7 p.m. You look at them, you have 5 votes to cast, and then in the end, the 2 proposals that get the highest number of votes pass to the next phase, meaning the 2 citizens or members of the five-star movement who have proposed them get a tutor from the parliamentary group, and the tutor helps them transform the idea into an actual bill of law that is then eventually introduced into parliament. We can talk about the fact, if you want, also that voting on Rousseau is kind of a farce, because it can be manipulated very easly. There is no certification of the vote by external third parties, and from what I know, there is no end-to-end encryption. So it is likely that the company that runs Rousseau, because it's a web marketing company that actually runs it, which has donated the platform to an association that is called the Association Rousseau, which is a non-profit. But it's likely that they are able to see actually how individual members vote on every single issue. So it's pretty troubling from what I think.
Thank you, Marco. It seems like a very elaborate system, and I think we get back to the question whether this type of a model is a utopia or a dystopia later on. But Maija, I wanted to ask you about the paper about the open ministry. Now, this is a platform where there's actual deliberation going on, right? I just wanted to ask you what your findings were and why they were interesting, and also maybe you can explain to the audience some of the key concepts that are being used in the academia to describe this kind of democratic crisis that we have right now, the input legitimacy versus the output legitimacy, and what is throughput legitimacy. So please educate us.
Thank you. I'll go to the paper first, because now when I still remember what we wrote and found out, we looked at one specific initiative in Finland that was about banning fur farming, the industry of fur farming, and that was one of the first initiatives back in 2013. And we studied, we surveyed the users of Open Ministry, so those who had signed the fur farming initiative. We surveyed them at the moment when they signed the initiative, and also after the parliament had decided on what the parliament will do with the initiative. So we have this kind of pre and post survey, and we were interested in, because the common critique for these kind of soft direct democratic institutions is that well, they rarely lead to policy impacts, so people will be frustrated. And also this fur farming initiative was eventually rejected by the Finnish parliament, so the parliament didn't want to ban this whole industry of fur farming. So, and in a way, the people who signed the initiative, their kind of effort was, no, it didn't lead to the result they hoped for. But so the first finding, and there were roughly 700 respondents, if I remember correctly. So the first result that we found, so basically we were interested in how their attitudes towards the political authorities, how they change when they find out what the parliament actually did with the initiative. And first we found that overall kind of the trust to political authorities, it decreased to some extent. So when the result was rejection, the signers of initiatives were less trustful. But then our second finding, what I think is maybe even more important and has relevance to all different kinds of online participation tools and platforms, is that also the process matters quite a lot. So the process, what happens after the signatures are collected, and what happens within the parliament, how the initiative is handled and discussed and communicated back to the initiators. That also matters, because what we found was that those people who were satisfied with the way Parliament handled the initiative, so they were satisfied with the parliamentary proceedings, their trust didn't decrease. But for those who saw that the Parliament handled the initiative like disrespectfully, it was them who actually trusted less authorities. So what's the takeaway, what's the lesson from this, is that kind of procedural fairness can increase trust towards authorities, even if people don't get what they want. So even if it doesn't have the policy impact, the process and the handling of the citizens' input also matters. I hope I'm being clear enough, but something along these lines. And maybe you were asking about these 3 types of legitimacy. Kind of the broader framework is that you can talk about input legitimacy when we kind of ask that who participates and how representative participation is. Are there participation biases? Like, are some groups systematically missing from online participation platforms? That's the input side. And then the throughput is kind of these procedural issues. And then output legitimacy concerns with the policies and the actual decisions at the end of the policy-making process. So I think with any kind of online participation tool, and if we want to measure their impacts, it's important to look at these 3 different aspects: that who participates, and how the citizens' inputs are being handled, responded, and kind of dealt with, and then also finally that whether it actually becomes policy or not.
Thank you. There was a great clarification. And I think the throughput aspect is what is most important concerning the technology itself, because technology has the opportunity or the ability to kind of change the process a little bit, make the process, democratic process, a bit more fair.
Can I add to the
sure,
because
please.
you also mentioned that OpenMinistry.fi, this platform, it has a feature that users can also discuss, so deliberate on the initiative topics, which for example the official government-run Citizens Initiative platform doesn't have this discursive feature, but this NGO-run platform has. But in our study, or in our survey to the users, it's actually quite, it's a shame, but it's only used by approximately 7% of the users. So less than 1/10 of the users actually discuss the initiatives. So it's a small minority that kind of really engage in thinking that if this is a good thing or bad thing, and kind of listening to maybe different views and arguments, but it's mostly used for just signing, kind of. Yeah, so this is a challenge to, I think, all kinds of online platforms, whether people actually exchange their views, or only go to these enclaves where they know that their views are already supported.
Thank you. Pierre-Louis, your experience with DemocracyOS clearly shows that you need to work hard to engage people. Am I right? Yeah. But is there any other feature that is kind of fatal for e-democracy tools that result in failure? I mean, you've done so many projects in your career, and I'm sure some of them must have failed as well. Can you describe those failures perhaps as well, and why do you think they failed?
Many failed, but the main challenge is not to make sorry. The main challenge is not to make false promises to the citizens, because when you put on an online platform, you're basically telling, well, tell us what you think about this issue, and if you have not thought through the whole process afterwards of what is going to be done with this contribution, it will be a great source of distrust with the community you are trying to engage. So. So you have to be very careful when you engage on such a public debate, and we, the government, are always now starting online debates, and I think what we have to do is to improve the way we are going to fix the objectives, and what is going to be put in place to follow up these public debates. And a lot of the civic tech field in France has been focusing on such tools as DemocracyOS. What is funny is that we had the tools which were built before having an issue. So we had no public, no issue, no solutions, but a tool. And then the government is trying a lot of tools. We have a lot of public debate going on with a lot of different tools, but we do not necessarily know what we're going to do with public contribution afterwards, and the tools itself has an influence on how you're going to produce a synthesis, a report with the material that you're giving by the citizens. So we have to think of where this tech comes from. We have an example of a tech from a political party which produces the effects needed by a political party, a tool built for a government, but we have all these other tools that we implement. Some are built by for-profit companies, so some are built by international communities, and we have to be always be very wary of how we're going to use these tools. And we have a strong focus on public debate in France, and perhaps we should shift other concerns, because it will be difficult to to completely build from scratch a law with public debate. It will be very difficult to draft a complete policy with such a platform. Yet, I'm not saying it should not be done. I'm not saying it is not possible. But at the state of the political process and administrative process, we are not yet there. It's very useful, and we think in terms of masses, or we have to be inclusive. We run a very technocratic debate with DemocracyOS for the government about very specific issues of about how are we going to draft guidelines for local government for them to implement digital policies. So it was a very small issue, but when our team inherited this mandate from the law to do this consultation, we had all the usual suspects: the local government lobbies, the consultants, and we could have done our report with our with our usual partners. But building these tools, which it was not very inclusive, it was not very public. We had a few hundred comments, but we could identify new NGOs, new local governments, new companies we were not talking before, and for that the process has been improved. So it was a very small step, but with such a tool, it was interested enough. And but I'm not saying that the inclusion factor is not important, because we are also the government task force working on digital inclusion, and we released a report 3 days ago about the state of digital divide in France, and we basically have 7 million citizens who do not use internet regularly. 40% of low-income citizens estimate that they do not know how to use a computer. Against that, you have 18% of higher income citizens who do know how, who identify themselves as not knowing how to use a computer. So we have these huge income gaps in terms of skills, gender gaps as well, and we have to be very careful when we build our tools to include the population. So, but it's more on the before we are thinking of a tech. We have to think of how we are going to, why are we going to ask people their opinion, who are we want to include, and that's it. The tech comes at the end. And every time we failed, that we did a debate for the debate's sake. So, we have a policy problem, so we have to ask the citizens their opinions, so let's do a debate, and then nobody came. So.
Okay, so there's a lot of this kind of feel-good rhetoric associated with e-democracy tools quite often, and this may lead to kind of overhype and thus kind of not regret but frustration, yes, by participants. But there are a lot of political forces out there who are kind of jumping on the bandwagon. For example, in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn in these elections had a digital manifesto where he promised that he will have massive online meetings for open to everyone, and basically one reporter just said that, well, that's just Twitter, like how is it any different from Twitter? And I wanted to ask Marco now, do you think that there is a difference between being politically active on social media, for example, and being politically active on a purpose-built platform? Is there any difference, or is it all just kind of one echo chamber after another?
No, there are many differences, of course, because if you are on a dedicated platform already, you made a choice, right? Whereas if you are on Facebook, you probably made a choice just because your friends were there. So it's quite different. And in the case of Corbyn, I'm not sure where it's headed, but my understanding is that the massive online deliberation tool that they wanted to introduce is Police, which is this tool, basically massive deliberation tool developed by a startup in Seattle that has been used for the most part, is known as a use case in Taiwan. It's been used by the Taiwanese government as part of a larger decision-making process called GOV, G-O as in zero, V. And what is important there in the case of, so the Taiwanese government has been using this tool to get citizens to deliberate on certain bill proposals that are for bills of law that are internet related. So they used it with some success in relation to the regulation of Uber, right? And the sale of alcohol via the internet, and a few other bills like that. And they got a few thousand citizens to participate directly via Facebook. In this case, police is able to bypass, in a certain sense, that dichotomy, because you are on Facebook and you use Polis as a Facebook application, or you are on Twitter, you can use it also on Twitter. And what Polis does is that it asks a question to you, right? So for example, how would you regulate Uber, right? Like, do you think that Uber should be allowed to operate? I'm not sure whether it's allowed, it's legal in Estonia. In Italy, it's illegal, for example. And what happens is that immediately, in the case of Uber, two groups of pro and against Uber internet users form, right? But what Polis does is that it disables comments against, right? It maps these groups, so it provides a dynamic map. It is kind of artificial intelligence based. So it sees that a certain cluster of internet users are agreeing on saying being pro-Uber, and then another cluster of internet users, based on their comments, on their responses to this question, is actually disagreeing, right? But the two groups can't fight each other in a certain sense. You can only add more reasons to your group, and then what the AI does is that it finds a certain, and you can give likes also to the other group, right, to certain comments from the other group. So what the AI does is that at a certain point it finds a sentence, a comment, that finds consensus overlap of the two groups, right? So for example, in the case of Uber, one user said, regardless of what we think or whether we are against or for Uber, I think that the public transportation industry in Taiwan needs to be modernized, right? So the two groups agree, yes, it needs to be modernized. So then the next question would be, how can it be modernized, right? So the two groups answer on the basis of that kind of middle ground that has been found around the question of modernization, right? And of course, you can see that in this process, there is a series of political values and assumptions that are built into it, right? It's an application that looks for consensus. It looks for middle grounds, which kind of makes sense in the case of highly polarizing issues. But you also wonder whether sometimes conflict and disagreement is a political value in itself, and why software should be built around the notion that it should disable disagreement, right? The same is true for that Icelandic Better Neighborhood, Better Reykjavik, right? Platform. On Better Neighborhood, you can basically add motivations to be for something, but you cannot be against something, right? So you start to see how all these civic tech applications, if you want, also have a certain ideology built into them. I also wanted just to reconnect for a second to that question of input, output, and deliberation, right? There is this notion of the pyramid of participation, right? Obviously, you're going, which was Tim O'Reilly in 2004 already wrote about the fact that the vast majority of internet users, of course, Facebook is popular because you can just like something. It takes a second to like something, right? So if you look at the ratio between the number of likes and the number of comments on a certain issue, it's always going to be, according to O'Reilly, 10 to 1. For 10 likes, there's going to be one person who bothers to write a comment, right? So these tools are designed to have all these kind of different levels of granularity built into them, so you can participate as little or as much as you want, okay? And I don't see anything wrong with it. And that's why also with, you know, the 5-star movement, Rousseau functions pretty well in this kind of idea that you're constantly voting, right? And then I'm critical, and I'm like, yes, but you can't vote without being well informed. You need to have a discussion, and everybody would, you know, would say yes. In an ideal world, everybody would have a discussion, would read a lot, but that's not how real democracy works. Even when there are general elections, do you think that the vast majority of people go and vote after they read a lot about the issues? That's not how it works. To vote, it takes only a few minutes. In Estonia, it takes a few seconds because you can do it online now, right? Maybe it can take half an hour or an hour in a different country if you go to a physical booth. But ask people why they're voting, on how well informed they are, and you will find out that the vast majority of people are not that well informed. You ask them, do you know the program of the party that you're voting for? Have you read it? Seriously, like how many people have read the program of the party? No, they vote for that politician or that because they trust them, right? So there's all these other elements that come into play. So when we talk about also these applications, we should be wondering to what extent they should be mirroring existing processes, to what extent they should be extending them to the internet, to what extent they should introduce also new elements that transform the democratic process. Right?
This leads me nicely to my next question, actually. Just to provoke you, you all work on issues that are related to kind of innovations in democracy. So there's an underlying assumption that there's something wrong with the system at the moment that needs kind of fixing or upgrading, but maybe it's just a question of a few bad apples. What if we just had better politicians? You know, where does this leave us? Is there something wrong with the system, or is it just, you know, we're having a bad time? You know, it's a bad decade. I don't know. Maija, would you take this first? It's a question for all of you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I study the symptoms of this crisis. I'm not sure about the causes, but I think it's both. It's the structure, the system, and people as well. I wasn't thinking about politicians, but like citizens as individuals. That's part of the reason why we are in a crisis. So citizens, the demands and expectations for democracy have changed. Like values have changed, and all these post-materialistic values have become more popular, and also people. There are these international surveys collected every now and then, and in all like developed democracies, that people generally support wider use of referendums, for example. So there is this kind of general acceptance of this idea that citizens should also be able to participate, not only in elections, but also between elections, and maybe the representative institutions have taken this message seriously quite late. So yeah, it's a good question. And then also in terms of political parties, this cleavage structure has changed, and also, yeah, I think it's in the parties themselves too. So it's both.
Okay. Well, Marco, what do you think? Is it the system, or is it just?
Well, on this I have a mini essay in my head. No. Well, I just wanted to make it, like, expand a little bit the framework on the crisis of representation, right? Because this has been around for a while. Political scientists have been talking about the crisis of political representation for decades now. But I think we can look at it from three different perspectives. One is kind of a very broad historical plane, which basically says that the crisis of political representation invests, for the most part, mature democracies, right? we already make a mistake if we think that this is happening worldwide in the same way in every country. It's actually a malaise of the Western world for the most part. For example, in India, you have very high levels of political participation. In Italy, after World War II and up until the 60s and even 70s, you have over 90% of the people going to vote for 3 or 4 decades. And we are now, only 30 or 40 years later, down to 50%, right? So this is something that is really, it's began declining slowly in the 80s, and then 90s has continued to decline, and then it plunged over the past 10, 15 years, right? But it started before, so I think we should be taking this broader picture. And one way of thinking about it is the complexification of civil society in Western democracies, right? Up until the 50s, in maybe not in the former USSR, in the Eastern Bloc, but in the Western Europe, in the US, income was a pretty good, reliable indicator of how you were going to vote. Then there were a few others, of course, rural versus urban, religion. For example, in Italy, the democratic Christians always had a very strong base among farmers in the countryside. But if you were a politician, once you knew these 3 or 4 variables, you could pretty much, have a profile and say, this is kind of the audience that I'm going to target, right? Beginning in the 60s, right, with the various civil rights movements in the US first, and then sexual liberation movements, feminism, etc., you begin to see the rise of new subjectivities within society, new interests, environmentalism. There are so many other variables that come into play. In the US, you have gun control versus. So when you vote for somebody, it's like, does this person really represent me, right? Most likely, never, right? It's very difficult for you to find an individual. You can find maybe a party that has an orientation, but you will see immediately, especially if you think about Democratic Party versus Republicans in the US, that there are the social conservatives there who might have a progressive agenda on civil rights issues. This is never quite, it's never quite matching, right? So the crisis of representation in this sense can be seen as a byproduct of this complexification of society. And parliament, no matter what, government, no matter what, is too narrow to represent this kind of wider, broad set of issues. Second level is the thesis of the losers of modernization, globalization, right? Cultural, there's two definitions. This is sociological research that has been pretty extensive over the past 20 years or so. Cultural shocks of every kind, and on the other hand, economic shocks, and we know this pretty well now, right? Outsourcing of manufacturing work to the East, in particular to China, Vietnam, etc., has created the feeling that in our societies, the losers, those who have lost something from globalization, are many more than what we might have thought, right? A lot of people talk about the reasons of why Trump won the elections, which was a true shock in the United States, where I lived for the past 11 years. Well, he was the only one, besides Bernie Sanders, who was saying that he was going to repeal NAFTA, right? I don't know if you remember NAFTA, but it's the free trade agreement, right, between the United States. So he was speaking to this kind of Rust Belt working class that was left behind, that either didn't vote or voted for him. So that's the economic losers. And the cultural losers, there's so many other reasons. I'm not going to go into that now. And then the third idea is more a media explanation as the filter bubble thesis, right? That not only you feel that the political system has abandoned you and so on and so forth, but you begin to find online people who think exactly like you through this kind of positive feedback, self-reinforcing feedback that social media platforms have built into them, so that you are always engaged, right? And you are engaged with politics also if you are likely to have conversations with like-minded people, right? And that So there is somebody like Cass Sunstein, who is a professor in the United States, who first wrote about this before the rise of social media, actually just analyzing the blogosphere. He talks about the daily me, about the fact that you constantly get exactly what you want to read, and he mourns this kind of time of the broadcast media system, which was much narrower as a set of information that you would get, but that it was a space that everybody, especially public television debates, everybody would access, right? Everybody had access to the same information. Whereas right now, everybody's closed in its own filter bubble, and therefore the public is so highly fragmented that it ultimately becomes unrepresentable. So to answer your question, it's not a question of bad apples. There are very structural reasons why this crisis of representation, large structural reasons why the crisis of representation is deepening, that come from afar, but that are probably intensifying, have been intensifying over the past decade or so.
You in France have Macron now, so he's kind of a good apple, isn't he?
Well, speaking as an on-duty civil servant, I obviously won't comment on the merits of elected officials of my country. But what Marco said about structural roots applies as well to the administration, and it is true that all considerations about the elected officials, bad apples, and any crisis of representations we might have, it is true that we have to drift away from a certain culture of secret that we have in the administration. We also had a lot of law this past month and years about transparency, about corruption that were long awaited in France. And it's a global movement towards open data and open government, which is much needed and which will enable us to explain, to be more transparent, and to constrain us in the way we write policy, which will be very helpful and needed for the citizens. But we are still in the middle age of open data, and nobody understands or cares in the global citizenry about what these datasets mean. So we also have a great deal of effort to do to make sense of all of these data we are opening by law now, because it's mandatory to open data, but it's not sufficient enough to be transparent. You have to tell something about it to show what's really going on behind the administrative machines. That will be a main challenge. It's my way not to answer your question.
Well, coming back to representation issues, in France you have this party called Ma Voix, and they have proposed that we don't even need representatives anymore, because who represents us the best? I mean, we do. So they have an app which kind of, if a member of the Ma Voix party gets into parliament, everyone who is a constituent of that person can vote on this app, and the representative will vote exactly how people voted on the app. He will kind of give away his free mandate. So this brings me to one of my last questions that I have. Maybe we don't even need representatives anymore with this kind of technology. Do you agree? There are many activists who say we don't, and they're building tools for it. Where does the line go? How much institutional design is needed to balance these two aspects?
Well, we tried the binding mandate after the French Revolution. It was not a great success. So I'm not very convinced in the whole binding mandate thing. If we have elected officials, that we can assess the situation and vote in its conscience. And you can have all the tech you want. What is going to be voted will be voted by a group of persons. And who is this group of persons voting on the app? What is the electoral base? So you can have all the flows of the representative democracy that can apply to these new models of connected MPs. Because Ma Voix still wants to put MPs in the National Assembly, but we have to vote as the app tool, which is unconstitutional in France, by the way, so it will be difficult. And I'm not sure that the binding mandate was very successful in Italy as well within the
it wasn't never tested.
So and well, all it assumed that all the electorate will participate, and every elector has a rational behavior. So I'm not sure it's been really proven by social science. So I'm very skeptical by this experience of binding mandate through tech. In practice, it's in theory it might be seducing. I don't see how it can be applied in a practical context.
Do you academics both agree with this assessment? Maija?
I'm afraid, at least at this stage, until I see more empirical research on this kind of direct democracy or binding mandate, I am also very skeptical, and I think from the perspective of democratic theory and just normative theory, that in all kind of understandings of democracy, whether it's representative or participatory, there needs to be some space or some stage for the collective will formation or this deliberation. And now if we think about this binding mandate, what this means is that, like, because parliaments then, when they were created, they were not only legislative assemblies, but they were the main forum for deliberation and exchanging views and hearing other arguments. And that's their role still, to provide a forum for this kind of deliberative discussion. And that's why MPs also should have the possibility to listen to others' views and then reflect and maybe change their own views. And this kind of parliament as a deliberative forum, that would no longer exist with this kind of binding mandate. And that's another thing that I sometimes wonder with the most those who are most enthusiastic about the potential of technology to kind of reform democracy, is that sometimes these tech enthusiasts kind of idealize and really think a lot about the classical Athenian democracy, and that's like the gold standard that we could somehow achieve with these new technological tools, so that citizens could assemble not in the ecclesia but online and then decide together on things. But again, with this image, people also tend to forget that even this Athenian assembly was first and foremost a forum for deliberation, and then there was a vote after deliberation. But this discursive features have always been really important, and that's why I'm skeptical for this technology.
But Marco, if the Rousseau platform, for example, managed to institutionalize deliberation as well, and even better deliberation than would ever be possible in a parliament, do you think that would be a viable option? Or are you skeptical for more reasons than deliberation?
Well, I want to say that I'm skeptical of the binding mandate, but I'm not skeptical of the possibility of transforming the institutional representative democracies. Between representative democracy and direct democracy, there is this gray zone of participatory democracy, which is very undefined, and precisely because it is undefined, I think it's interesting, right? So I don't think we should either have what we have or a situation in which the representative just pushes a button that follows the will of the constituents. There's a gamut of things in between. Perhaps the most advanced proposal for certain level of bindingness is the one that comes from a lawyer of Podemos, Moreno Jäske, who has this proposal of a Democracia 4.0, he calls it. So the idea there is that citizens vote from home on every bill of law, right? They assuming that it's safe to vote from home, that cannot be tampered with. Depending on how many people vote, the vote of the elected representative is inversely proportional as power. So I will explain it. In Spain, I think they have 35 million people who are eligible to vote, and roughly 350, I think 350 representatives. So one representative is worth 100,000 voters. If, say, 85,000 people vote for that representative, the vote of that representative in parliament will be worth 0.15, okay? If 100,000 people vote, the representative vote will be worth just one, his own vote. If 10,000 people vote, the vote of the representative is worth 0.9, okay? All of this sounds, I think it's an interesting proposal, but the question that remains open is the question of deliberation. Who gets to set the agenda, right? So what the parliament does is not the parliament is a place where people go vote and push a button, right? They sit there for weeks and months to make a calendar, right, which is highly political, in which you decide what gets voted and what doesn't get voted, right? That's the first level of where power is actually measured, right? And it's called agenda setting, right? So for me, all these platforms have a value if they're able to transfer, to a certain extent, certain skills and powers and competencies that now only belong in the institution from the representatives to the represented. And for me, we should be finding ways, kind of an index of gauging to what extent, say, CitizenOS does that on the three fundamental axes of representation, which are the power to decide, right? The power to represent a certain constituency. So if only, say, highly educated white males vote online, obviously that vote is not very representative. It's representative only of a very specific demographic of the population. And then the third level is the level of the deliberation, right? So representation, deliberation, and decision-making are three components of representation as a whole that you can transfer to these platforms, each one of them to the citizens, but you have to assess which ones are transferred, why they're not, like the work you've done in Nanterre, right? You put a lot of work into going there and telling people, look, you can use this platform, but if they don't use it, you cannot claim that that platform is representative. At least when they went to vote, if they voted, right, they elected an institution that can claim to be representative, right? Whereas the platform is not, if only very specific demographic part of it. If the platform doesn't allow people to deliberate, then you can say, look, at least in the parliament they can deliberate. So then the next step is, how do we build deliberative tools into the platform? So the first step is, how do we bring people into the platform? The second step is, how do we get to produce an opinion-forming process? And the third step is, ideally, obviously, is how do we get them to decide, right? How do we make preference aggregation? So from this perspective, these tools are interesting because it's a democratic perspective, democratization process, right? Otherwise, we just analyze them from the perspective of their technical efficiency, which is more the perspective of e-government, right? And it's a different set of questions. I'm not saying that e-governance or collaborative governance or open governance are wrong, but it's a different angle. It's the angle of the institution. From the citizen's perspective is whether these platforms are really able to transfer the skills and powers and competencies from the institution to the social body. And all the work that goes into that is not a technical work. It's not going to be an app to solve it. It's political work, or techno-political work in the best case scenario.
So a lot of work still to be done, it seems like. I hope someone from Estonia is also here and has taken note of all the interesting things that have been happening abroad as well. We do have excellent e-government, e-services, but in terms of e-democracy, we have so much to learn, and I thank you all for sharing your experiences with us. And now we have some time for questions.